it's my pleasure to introduce our lecturer this evening, Kelli Anderson. Kelli Anderson is a designer, an artist, and an engineer who's been working with papercraft and many other kinds of ingenious systems for some time. She's been dubbed by Brain Pickings. Kelli Anderson is one of the most talented, thoughtful, and inspiring young designers working today, bringing to each project an artist's flair, a scientist's rigor, and a philosopher's deliberation. I think you'll find her work stimulating and charming. It's my terrific pleasure to introduce Kelli Anderson.
Thank you all so much for having me. This is definitely a magical place. Anytime anti-disciplinary is in the title, it's a magical place, but this is an especially magical place. So I'm going to try to live up to that hyperbolic introduction here. My name is Kelli. I'm an artist and designer, and I live in Brooklyn, New York, but I'm originally from New Orleans, and from my apartment, I draw and code and glue paper together. And I once designed the interior and exterior of a now beloved New York City restaurant in Photoshop. So that's pretty much my life. But I think the unifying thread in my work is that I tend to be drawn to program experiences that people don't necessarily realize are programmable. I really like working with materials that are so lo-fi and low-tech and unassuming that they just barely register as existing at all. They just are sort of like this overlooked part of the landscape. And I think that love comes partly from my practice as a graphic designer, because this is a profession that definitely forces you to acknowledge the very humble, unassuming, and circuitous ways that meaning is made. That you can be designing something and use a serif rather than a sans serif, and it completely changes it. It's sort of a practice that blows apart your preconceived notions of what is signal and what is noise, which questioning that relationship I think is really important to me as a maker. But I also like working with unassuming materials because when people expect nothing, there's a whole lot of potential to do something really surreal with that nothing. And this is something that I learned from the first big design project that I worked on about 10 years ago now. This was all the way back when the Iraq War was raging. The Bush administration was in charge, and we all had no hope for the future at all, which seems incredibly naive right now. But all of my friends were like, we want to do something. We're sick of marching in protests. Let's actually change the world. So we came up with this project, which we codenamed Because We Want It. And it was dreamed up by my friend Steve Lambert and organized by the activist group, the Yes Men, and then executed by many, many people, including me, in my apartment. Early one Thursday morning, we blanketed New York City with an alternate reality, one featuring a more benevolent type of alternative fact, where we ended the Iraq War, we closed Guantanamo, we created rail service that crisscrossed the United States, we gave Appalachia internet, the US government gave all land back to Native people. We came up with economic policies that put the country on the path to equity rather than driving the classes apart. And we set the groundwork for a more informed future citizenry. So these are all headlines in our paper, but all of the text was carefully written as a roadmap for progressive victories, and they were all enabled by popular pressure rather than relying on a single political leader to bring us there. So it was like this little utopian simulation where everything we wanted came true. And we made it not with technology or VR or anything really, but just with paper by essentially hacking the authority of this familiar morning time object. We took apart a New York Times. I found this style guide that someone had foolishly forgotten to set to no index in Google. So we knew exactly what font, what letter spacing, what kerning, what paragraph style to use. And we put it back together again as this pristine counterfeit depicting this utopian future that we could arrive at if we all worked together. So we didn't bother telling the New York Times about our improvements. We just mass produced it. We silk screened these like really cute like newsboy aprons to look super legitimate. And then we put them in hands of hundreds of thousands of unsuspecting commuters. And there were a lot of like U-Haul trucks involved. We like saw the mass of paper. We can barely believe the piles, but so you can see here that the hoax part of it worked really well because people could feel like in their hands for a second what a different world might feel like. Don't get hit by a bus. Yeah, this definitely set the bar for like all future graphic design projects. Like if I wasn't asking, am I gonna get arrested for doing this project? Like it wasn't fun anymore. So you know, the alternative reality we created was pretty fleeting. You can see like for most people, it lasted about like 8 seconds for real. But our fake newspaper got on the real news all over the world. So we got people angry and asking, you know, well, if, you know, visually these headlines are bullshit, like what other order in the world, like, doesn't deserve my respect? You know, like, what is it about our system that's actually broken? It's funny how short a leap that is. You know, the more complacent people are about, like, interacting with an object in their lives, like the morning paper, it's just really hard to, like, argue with that physical evidence when it's in your hand. And they become really surprised when it turns on them. And the flip side of that is that like this pit of possibility opens up, you know, that people get really riled up and excited about democracy again, just because of graphic design tricks, essentially. So in a high-tech world, I find myself more and more drawn to these very like humble lo-fi experiences as a means to like reframe how I think about the world and how an audience thinks about and interacts with the world. And a lot of lo-fi magic exists firmly in this realm of novelty. Like you see it once, you realize it's a trick, and then you're never fooled again. Like my cat is like, this is not a real wolf. But there's this other side of it, because when we experience something that feels like magic, we're talking about an experience that feels beyond explanation. And sometimes that's because those experiences are a fiction or a contrivance. But sometimes like we're legitimately interacting with a blind spot in our understanding about how the world works. So this is a little example of this. This is a interactive book I made based on research by a Swiss scientist named Emin Gabrielen. And it uses Moiré interference patterns to create the illusion of magnification. So when you move the grid's perfectly sized to be the exact size as the underlying grid of printed squares underneath it. And when you move it left to right, those dots like appear, or those squares appear to animate. But when you rotate it, they zoom in and out. So it's a way of like magnifying something. And so the Swiss scientist is actually using this in like little tiny like lo-fi gauges to like make numbers appear to get bigger. But it's not like a glitch in the materials. It reveals that there's like this glitch in our brain, like how our perception works. And so this works the same way as like driving down the street and seeing a billboard that's obstructed by a tree and still being able to read it does. Like our brains have this like built-in pattern finding mechanism. And so anytime you are selectively covering up those little squares, you know, your brain wants to complete the circle, and that's why it appears to get bigger or smaller. If that doesn't make sense, come talk to me later. It's like fascinating. So this is another weird lo-fi thing. This is a very strange card that I made for my friends over the holidays. I put them in an envelope. There's no text and no instructions. It simply guides the recipient through the experience through material memory. So paper is a material that doesn't forget how it's bent. So if you fold a piece of paper, it wants to flop that same way forever. And so when people pick up this card, it wants to flop in like certain pre-programmed ways. And people quickly discover that bending the card moves them through this very simple story. And you can see that's a story about itself. So the card is basically this 4-frame documentary about receiving this card. And you just can do it forever. So this is about as simple as a thing can get. It's a single sheet of paper, and it has a couple cuts on it, 2 glue dots. But, you know, it's something that I understand how it works at all of its different states, but I don't understand it in its totality. So even though it is very simple and lo-fi, it still like yields this complexity. It has this complex potential in it that you can explore. So in the case of things like this, I exit making these kinds of experiences, and I feel like I made it, but I have no clue how it works. And like traditionally in more, whatever you'd call it, non-anti-disciplinary art practices, you know, this concept of post facto rationalization, like figuring out why things work or why you did it after you did it, is often looked down upon, because your process is supposed to be informed and guided by reasons. And so the idea that like you didn't know what you're doing, but you made this thing, and yes, of course that's what I was doing, is a little bit absurd. But as I get like older and crankier, like this is my real motivation, is like stumbling upon these things where it does this magical thing, but then like it's up to me to like figure out like why it did that. The things that behave the way that I don't expect them to are the best things, and those are the things that I want to pursue. I've just like found that like everything has these inner levels of complexity, this unexplored territory that you can like tunnel into. So paper, which is my favorite right now, is really like this most mundane and ubiquitous material, but it can also be the most profound, because it's inherently structural. It never works alone. It can be shaped to tap into all of these like forces in the world that we can't see. Like a piece of paper can be manipulated to catch the wind and act as a kite, you know, or can be rolled up into a cone and amplify sound like a megaphone. You know, or origami structures can like model math that, you know, no one can understand in their mind. So paper I think of as this like tangible interface on realms of the abstract and the invisible that are really difficult to, you know, interact with and get at otherwise. Like this example, like you can understand like the mysterious topological features of a Mobius strip by reading the Wikipedia article, or you can do what like every third grader does and take a strip of paper, like twist it once, tape the ends together, and then you end up with this little contraption called a Mobius strip that takes a 2-sided surface and makes it a 1-sided surface. So this is like just one thing that's like vastly easier to understand in paper than on paper. You know, oftentimes our tactile and intuitive and experiential understanding precedes formal understanding in this really dramatic way. And for me, that's like a really good argument for why it's okay to like not know what you're doing and to truly be experimental in your approach with materials. Many of the concepts that I had sort of just like assumed drop from the sky as like perfectly formalized abstractions, like, you know, where does like the equation for the circumference of a circle come from? Are all these ideas that were first discovered by hand that were only later formalized into math. So here are different mathematical investigations of the relationships between curves and circles. And yet, anthropologists have recently found that even the perfect circle, which seems like an abstraction too perfect to be made by hand, was first made by the human hand. So this totally looks like a Krispy Kreme donut, but it's one of the first circles produced by man, and it's made through a gesture. Because when you take a small hard stone and start rotating it into a larger rock, it digs in and establishes this fixed center axis point and scrapes away the softer rock at a consistent distance from that center axis. And the only shape that can result from such a gesture, such like a dance move, is a perfect circle. So if you're interested in those concepts about how these abstractions are being investigated like in tangible terms, this is a really good book. This is Geometric Folding Algorithms. It's by a guy at MIT named Eric Demain, who's sort of the patron saint of solving science and engineering problems with origami, which sounds kind of crazy, but it's not. If you're interested in it but don't feel like reading a very dense book, this documentary called The Origami Revolution, which Nova recently put out, is a really good primer on this thing. It just turns out that there's a lot of problems that are really pernicious and difficult to solve that are folding, unfolding problems. So these are some examples of the things that are being investigated, which this is not an illustration of, but one of the problems is what pattern should you fold up an airbag within a car steering column so it most rapidly unfurls upon impact? Or what's the fewest places you need to cut a folded protein sequence to unravel it and be able to, understand the sequence of data without completely destroying the structure? So by making these problems tangible and touchable, the researchers are opening them up to this whole other dimension of physical intuition. And it turns out that the hand working in tandem with the brain is smarter than the brain just trying to figure things out by its own. So knowing this, in my own artistic and design practice, I realize I can get a lot farther in thinking about complexity if I can figure out a way to translate it into something I can play with. If I can make it a toy and I can tinker with it, then I can explore it. For example, if you think about making any kind of decision in life, from where should I go to school to what job should I take to who should I date, there's all of this overwhelming deluge of factors that your brain is just kind of weighing. So I was really overwhelmed trying to figure out whether I should take these freelance jobs that come my way or not. And so instead of just trusting my gut, I made this logic wheel. It's a paper calculator, and I decided to let it decide for me. So this format is called a Vowel. And before there were computers or even calculators, there was still this need for calculation. So people would make these wheel structures. This one is a farm calculator. So it's basically you put in that you want to get 15 bushel of asparagus in the fall, and you turn the little wheel and it tells you exactly how many seeds you need to buy and when you need to plant it. So these are kind of like the apps of the 1800s. But you can see that all of the logic and the proportions and the math are embedded in the physical structure of the thing. It's this series of nested cut wheels and windows, which is really super cool. So on mine, which is called the Existential Calculator, it's programmed with the social science research about what actually makes people happy when they take a job. And what ends up leading to a midlife crisis or other kinds of, work panic. And it boils down to four main considerations. And so the way that this works is that you turn these four different wheels and they align and they give you a certain output, and that tells you what your future holds. So the four different considerations are: is this job a good fit for you? Will the work improve the world, or is it terrible for the world? Are the working conditions okay, or are you basically working in a sweatshop? And what's the money like? So you turn those, and you can get one of, I think it's like 72 different colored dots. And so it gives you a colored dot, much like a mood ring. And then there's a guide on the back. And so you find your color, and then you trace it out. And every little line that you pass is a condition that applies to your situation. So it's, you know, you'll see like where you land on the spectrum of happy to miserable to like, you know, yeah, it's just okay. So it's a very like analog way of like calculating things, but the advantage to a system like this is that you can gaze out over this whole range of work and say, well, I really don't like where I am. I want to be over here. And then you can kind of like reverse engineer the process and like turn the wheel on the front and like figure out like what you're doing wrong or like what you need to change. And so it's a little bit of like a philosophical dialogue back and forth, like with these ideas of happiness and work and what the substance of work is. So another problem that I had that felt really overwhelming, which I think few people would consider a problem, but I just feel like I think a lot about like how big the internet is and how overwhelmed I feel about that. That it's kind of like walking into a room of uncertain size. And people say things like, you know, there's 1 billion new images uploaded to the internet every week. And so just like thinking about that is like, well, like there must be like some way to be able to figure out like exactly how dense like those images are and like find the bald patches and like just like understand like this quantity of data we're dealing with. So I've been thinking about that for a while and it just like bugged me. And I saw this film, Christian Marclay's The Clock. Has anyone seen that before? Oh, sweet. Yay. Lots of people. If you haven't seen it yet, I wouldn't like run out and go see it tonight. It's a 24-hour-long film. And basically, it recreates every minute of the 24-hour-long day using archival footage from the history of films. And so Christian Marclay must have a gazillion assistants. They go into the film archives, and the film functions as both a movie and also a timepiece, because you can walk into the theater at any time, and you'll be like, oh, it's 3:03 because someone's gazing at the clock in Grand Central, you know, and it says 3:03. So it's pretty cool. And like I went and saw this film, and I left, you know, feeling like, you know, he's creating this false continuity from all of these little discontinuous pieces, which was really cool. But the result of that is that I could really like feel how much film there is. Because if you have like a moment for 5 a.m. and 3:03 and 11:49, like if you can find all of that, if all of that data exists, then the film archives are very, very vast. So I was inspired by that concept. And I decided to try to create the Eames's Powers of 10, which is a short film that's about scale in the universe to demonstrate the scale of the internet. So I tried to recreate this film by finding found images on the internet. So I just did lots and lots of Google searches to try to find the moment when, you know, the guy is like laying on the picnic blanket in the park and his hand is on his chest. And when they're zoomed out right above the picnic blanket, what does that look like? I started using Google image searches like visually similar feature, which doesn't work the way that I assumed it had worked, because I was looking for compositionally similar images, but the way that Google image search works is that if you put in a still from a film, it figures out what film it is and then like feeds the text, the Powers of 10, back into Google search. And so I ended up getting all of this like, do you want a Powers of 10 mug? Do you want a t-shirt? Like rather than finding like the visually similar images. So I basically had to use like my own just like human creativity to think about, like, what are the scenarios where someone's going to have a hand on their stomach or chest? And so I went down like all of these very unpleasant corridors of the internet where I was like researching bulimia, and it got kind of nasty. But just pro tip, like if you're looking for images of hands on stomachs or chests, like search for boy bands. Like they all sing like this for some reason, but it's painful to be a boy band in love. So I got antsy before I found all of my images, so I like started stitching it together just to see if it would work, like if it was followable as an animation. And I did this, and I was like, yes, it totally works. I'm excited. I'm gonna do this. So here's how the whole thing turned out. It's a little bit choppy at first, but it gets better. I like the spooky sound effects. Yay! I didn't go all the way out to the far reaches of space because those images are taken by NASA, so it's not really like a test of the size of the internet, and I just got tired too. But it's funny, like the hard, does anyone have any idea like what the hardest images to find were? So the Ames's powers of 10 is a construct. Like they made it, it's presumably in Chicago, but like all of the picnic blanket grass scenes were shot on a film studio lot in Los Angeles. And the reason they did that is because there's never a moment where there's one picnic blanket on the grass. Like if it's a nice day, there's like 500, and if it's a crappy day, then like no one's out there. And so like that is like a human like limitation to that scenario. So like photographs of that specific scenario don't exist. So I actually like Photoshop cloned a whole bunch of grass and cheated a little bit. So I'm just like publicly admitting it. So don't hold it against me. So I put all of the frames back on the internet as this interactive flip book. And if you scrub left or right, it lets you like flip through the images. So you can see all of the images as those like little discontinuous pieces, and you can like make continuity at will by moving back and forth. So the most, in my career this far, like the most compelling proof that I've received that making lo-fi, low-tech things within like a high-tech world is a legitimate thing to do as an artist was the response that I received to this particular project. So I made this in 2011. Some friends of mine approached me to make their wedding invitation, and these were people who really super duper love music, and so they wanted a card that was musical in some way. And we're all thinking like, oh, well, it would be really sophisticated if it was interactive. And so we were like, initially we were talking about like making sheet music that people would somehow have to perform or play. But I ended up taking design inspiration from like my favorite place to take design inspiration, which is Mr. Wizard's show, which ran from like the 1960s to the 1980s. And I mentioned to my friends, Mike and Karen, who were getting married, I was like, you know, on Mr. Wizard, he did this incredible thing, and I think we should try to do it for your wedding invitation. And what he did was he rolled up a cone of paper and taped it shut, and he taped a needle to the very end of it. And that was enough to work as a record player. Like, it helps if you have, like, an electronic record player that turns it at exactly 45 RPM. But, you know, I reminded Mike and Karen of this episode, and they were like, oh yeah, we should totally do that for our wedding invitation. So then the onus was on me to like figure out how to actually make this work. So I started calling paper suppliers, trying to find the paper with the best audio properties, and they thought I was crazy. And then I also had to find like the correct spindle that was like the right size to like fit within a record, and a needle that would fit in the groove just properly. So I ended up like traveling around all of New York City, going to the garment district and buying every size sewing needle, and then going and buying all the acupuncture needles. But it turns out that they actually still make phonograph needles, and they're really cheap. So if you're ever working on a project like this, find phonograph needles, which that did not occur to me to check. But also in terms of like paper's audio properties, if you take a piece of paper and you hold it up and you shake it and it makes sound, it has good audio properties. Stuff like letterpress paper that's like really soft, like dampen sound, but yeah. So anyway, so meanwhile, the bride and groom were writing a song that invited people to the wedding. And we had it put onto a flexi disc, which is a really thin, flexible record. Like normally records are made out of vinyl and they're stamped. Flexi disc, I found out recently, are also stamped, but they're made out of this like really crappy acetate. So they used to be like in Rolling Stone and Maximum Rock and Roll, like record labels would make these like really cheap records to promote a single. Weren't really intended for multiple plays. It's just a really cheap record. But the reason I wanted to use this format was kind of like a design fallback because as you can see here, it's a clear flexi disc. The color printing you're seeing underneath is on the invitation itself underneath it. And I could have the couple, Mike and Karen, stamped on it in black. And so that way when you turned it, like every 90 degrees, you get them in a different scenario. So you're like, I'm completing the picture of my friends playing music together, and eating and drinking and being merry and getting old together. So, you know, when all these people are expecting like a nice high-end like letterpress wedding invitation, get this like contraption in the mail, and it doesn't work, like I was like, well, you know, at least they'll be able to complete the picture. So I was really hoping it would work. Like we tested and tested and tested everything, but like every other project, you have to order the printing and order the flexi disc and all the parts, and they all arrive like 3 days before they need to go out. And so it was sort of like everything was so finicky. It was difficult to isolate every single variable that was going to play a role. So it was kind of like a leap of faith doing this. But it did work. And this is how it worked. So that was a comparison of the sound quality of the flexi disc versus the mastered, engineered song. So it worked, but it was like really, really super lo-fi. But the way that it works, if you can see the little red circle on the very end of this piece of paper, there's a sewing needle sticking out of the tip of that. On that side of the paper, there's a little bit of weight. There's like a thicker piece of paper that we've adhered to that. So it weighs down on the needle just enough. And the sound is able to bounce around. Like all you need is that like tented negative space to allow the sound waves to like bounce around and magnify. So yeah, it worked. And it was the reaction to this was the funniest thing because I uploaded it to the internet, like very proud of myself, but like not really expecting anything. And people were really super excited about it. And I was kind of like, I was a little bit shameful about it. I was like, do they know how much this doesn't really work? Like, it sounds terrible. Like, we're all sitting around complaining about like, you know, obscure psychedelia albums not being in Spotify, and yet people want to like listen to this thing and use this. So like, it doesn't make any sense. So this is really a question that interests me. And I've been thinking about this for a while, and I realized that there's this like weird dimension in our relationship with things and how we interact with things that modern tech doesn't largely get yet. But I think it's getting there. So, modern tech is like designed to give us what we want. It's all about wish fulfillment. And it's kind of on this collision course with perfect efficiency. It's a logical extension of that original stated purpose of technology that began with our desire for tech to ease the burden of humanity and do all of our work for us, so we had more time to be human. This is a really funny paper cutter, which is like, it's promising, like, we are going to save you time. Look at this, we're going backwards. And of course, someone drew a penis on it, so I don't know what kind of statement this is about humanity, but it's kind of awesome. But there's definitely, was something meaningful in how less advanced tech worked. And it was kind of like a side effect thing that it was giving us by accident, I think. And that relates to how we work as human beings. We intellectually think about the world through our bodies and through touch much more than is acknowledged. So the nervous system doesn't end with the brain alone. It extends all the way out to the skin. So all information, not just the touchy, feely stuff, even technical information flows in through our senses in some way or another. Which is why data visualization is a thing, actually. Brett Victor writes about how the scatter plot graph was this unacknowledged, really important technological invention because it makes numbers bioavailable to the human mind, in a sense. You can't, input numbers as much as you want to into your brain like a spreadsheet. You have to put it on a map, which is essentially what a scatter plot graph did. In that kind of scenario, we're falling back on our more tangible reasoning skills. We can better understand the distance between point A and point B and the relationships hidden in the data if we're able to find a way to piggyback off of our, thousands of years of evolutions as human beings, like navigating the world and navigating space and navigating touch. So this is something I became really well acquainted with being a graphic designer because, for a while, every other client wanted like an infographic. Like infographics were like a really big thing like 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And so you become really good at like taking an abstraction and being like, all right, well, how does this lay out in space? Like, how would I navigate this? This is just an excuse to show you more work, really. But, objects like Mobius strips like demonstrate this too. Like the math is super hard. Like you need a PhD in math to even be able to get through the Wikipedia article, which is kind of like the most pedestrian form of explaining this concept. But touching it is really super easy. So, what modern tech seems to miss, even though I'm sure it's going to catch up, is that it's not about the thing and what the thing does. It's about how that thing connects us to the world. It's about how human reasoning is hardwired to work, how we're hardwired to have a very deep and very rich intellectual and philosophical life through our tangible exchanges with things. So old tech, by being more mechanical, is automatically fussy and glitchy and just crappy, but it's still pleasing and satisfying in this odd way, which I try to keep in mind when I make like stop motion animation pieces. I'll do things like I'll intentionally like leave in the string, which drives some people crazy, but or I'll leave in the noise. I'll show the seams. Low-fi things just provide this more meaningful connection point to these hidden infrastructures and forces and systems in the world all around us that are difficult to understand otherwise. These are all stop-motion animations I made for a company called Tiny Bop that makes interactive games for children, by the way. But the alarm clock was from a They Might Be Giants music video, so kind of a hodgepodge. But I think that's why people were into this, because it brings all of that information that you remember from science class about sound being vibration that moves air molecules, enters your ear, like moves an eardrum, all of that stuff that you read about, like it makes it real. So in this context, you know, you are turning a record with your hand and you're feeling the vibration, you're feeling the rhythm, and like the whole picture just sort of like comes together in this very satisfying way. So lately, as a designer, I'm trying really hard to like withhold judgment about what I consider a signal and what is noise, and kind of like step out of the way and like give people the entire experience to just sort of like tinker with and make work by themselves, which is honestly really hard because designers are like notorious control freaks, you know, like you want the color to be perfect. You want the paper to feel awesome. And so I'm making interactive experiences that I have to relinquish some of that control, give it to people, and let them like complete it essentially by playing with it. And that really like allows the magic to happen between the user and the object rather than like keeping it all to myself in my studio where no one else can see it. So I've been trying to facilitate experiences, and that's why I've been learning paper engineering the best I can. And I've been building things like this. This is called This Book is a Camera, and I'm very good at literal titles. It's a pop-up book that's a camera, basically. And this is how it works. You open the book, obviously, and then you go into the dark and you can load photo paper into the back of it. And then when you lift up this dark slide, it allows light to enter a pinhole, go through, hit the photo paper, expose it, and then you can bring it back home and develop it in a solution called Caffeinol. It's basically baking soda, instant coffee, and water. And you get photographs, and it's really fun to see kids play with this because they're like, where's the digital camera? It must be inside of it somewhere. Like, how does it do it? And it's like, no, like light just does that. And it's like by virtue of isolating a single light beam and putting something in there that interacts with that light beam, that's all you need to make a photo. And the photos are pretty good. This is one that I took on top of the Whitney Museum, looking north in the meatpacking district. And this is one that I took on the Brooklyn Bridge that it really highlights an interesting advantage of pinhole photography in that, like, if you look down the lines of all these little rivets on the Brooklyn Bridge, they're all kind of equally in focus. And that's because it doesn't have a lens. Like, normally, like, if you think of a lens, it's this curved convex surface. And the reason that it's curved like that is so that you can make a decision about where you're forcing the light beams to focus, to essentially cross over each other. Like the place where it crosses over is where it's most in focus. So pinhole photography, you get no focus. The light comes in flat, but the result of that is that everything is in equal focus. So you have no depth of field. So it's not like things off in the distance are less in focus than things close to you. So it has a very distinct look that looks like the 1800s for a reason. Yeah, so hopefully you'll see more people looking super cool in public places while everyone else is standing around using their smartphone. We made some in the printmaking shop last night, so you'll at least see those students with those. Oh, of course, it's like frozen on me. Okay. So this is like by far like my biggest realization of this whole concept and trajectory I'm on is last October. Chronicle Books published this book called This Book is a Planetarium, which again, like if anyone wants to give away the end of their like detective mystery novel, like come talk to me. I'm good with literal titles. But yeah, it's a book that reduces various tech gadgets down to just paper. There's 6 things in the book, and you know, the idea is that by stripping out all the electronics and interfaces and general like black boxiness of tech, that, you know, if there's nothing there, then all that's there are the laws of physics, and you're able to like more closely observe like what's going on with this nothing, basically. So there's things like this Perpetual Calendar that discusses a little bit about how our system of time is organized and how time is an invention to basically make what the heavens are doing, making it into like something that's predictable. And then this one's a little bit about how sound and pitch works. You can also really annoy your parents with it. And then I included this spiral graph. Can't say spirograph, but spiral graph. It's sort of like an introduction to the notion of like how changing the variable in something, like about how like, choosing a different size wheel, choosing a different dot on that wheel, affects the trajectory of these curves that it draws. So I told Zach that it's like the analog open frameworks, but I don't know. So here's the whole thing.
Standing there alone, the ship is waiting, all systems are go. Are you sure?
Yeah, so it's like a real thing that exists at Barnes & Noble, which is like totally crazy. Yay, that's done. This is a little quick behind the scenes that shows a little bit about how I like prototype these things and what the process is in making a
My name
pop-up
is
book.
Kelli Anderson, and I'm an artist and designer. I really like it when things don't behave as expected, because that's when learning is most memorable to me. I was drawn to working with paper because it seems like it's too humble a material to like actually do anything. But in fact, it can be bent to tap into these forces in the world that are otherwise really hard to see. Like, there's no piece of technology that makes the directional tendency of sound waves more evident than just like rolling up a paper cone and speaking into it. By making something handheld, like a book, I could both explain why light beams behave the way they do, and then also make that information touchable and visceral so people can get both a figurative and literal grasp on a few fundamental scientific principles.
Making a pop-up book is a multi-step process, and it starts by making really rough prototypes by hand, which are then sent over to the printer in Asia, and then they make their own prototypes using their more sophisticated mass production equipment. So the process has been a lot of doing and a lot of experimenting, but also a lot of stepping back and considering the whole picture. It's harder than most pop-up books because not only do the pop-ups have to function, they also have to work as objects that claim to do certain things, almost like product design considerations on top of the normal pop-up functioning.
See what I mean? It
This
grips.
feels good.
It grips really well.
Oh, yeah.
It spins easily. But if I lift up,
Yeah, it
it
immediately.
immediately falls.
If I want to know how a pop-up is actually going to work, I have to build it. I have to build it 20 times with 20 different little variations because things can be a millimeter off and they function completely differently. And this is the first planetarium, and you notice it's not really very round yet, and the stars are kind of
chubby. And so we are trying to make this better. And also it doesn't close. This is the first attempt. I started, quite honestly, by looking at other pop-up books. You know, I tore apart pop-up books. I looked at how things worked. I daydreamed about what these different pieces could be combined together to become. You know, I basically built every pop-up shape from every, you know, how to make pop-up book type instructional books. I draw everything in Illustrator as vector shapes and then output it to a cutting machine. And then I'm gluing and sort of shaping these things together. Check it out. For the graphic design for the book, you know, I'm taking these prototypes that we've built and photographing them, and I can design on top of it. I had a good time making all of these paper prototype contraptions by hand, but it was really fun seeing the final full color version come back from the printer. I hope it's not just me. I hope other people have a fun time playing with this too. Yeah, mass production's hard. It's like literally like the most disappointing thing I've ever done. But now it's like everywhere, so it's also magical. And people are sending me pictures of their kids, like people from all over the world are sending me pictures of their kids. Like these kids like apparently will not go to sleep without seeing constellations on their ceiling, which is cool. So we're almost out of time, but I just want to show you a couple like last little things. For example, I'm trying to make the record player into a pop-up book that's like acceptable for consumer use. Mine was hard because you had to turn it at exactly 45 RPM. So this is where I am in my prototyping so far.
Ranch. Really drove around on ATVs, fired bows and arrows in trees.
That's Conan O'Brien.
Played catch, scratch, fever.
Talking about Ted Nugent for some reason.
And then I baled hay. It was the whip.
But this one's better because it like lifts up and it goes over and it drops like a real record player. So that's exciting. It's also way louder, which you can't tell because this is just an iPhone video. But yeah, this is another thing I'm playing with. This is a basic concept that was developed by Chuck Hoberman, like the same guy who made the Hoberman sphere. This is something I read about in Nature. These are prismatic, reconfigurable prismatic architectures. Like there's a way to join almost every prismatic solid together and like slice it along a certain axis and like sort of multiply it, and you end up with this metamaterial thing where you can manipulate it in one direction and it ends up like expanding in the other direction. It's like so cool. I don't know what I'm gonna do with this. It's just a sketch, but also been spending a lot of time like with risographs and trying to make animations with them. So I'm up to that. This is another weird thing. Has anyone ever played with hydrophobic materials like Rain-X or Never Wet? Yeah. So that stuff is amazing. Like I've been doing typography and like doing animation by like basically making stencils and like covering the rest of the plate with Never Wet and then dumping water on it. Or like this is Strawberry Fanta. Strawberry Fanta's even better than water. And then I combine those plates together and it's like you can make an animated puddle, which is like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this, but it's super, super fun. So this is Bowie Bridge's horse. So I just like traced those frames and made a Bowie Bridge horse puddle. That's going to turn into something. I don't know what yet. So I'm going to end on this. This is kind of like my favorite lo-fi magic experiences. And my brain always like organizes things into these like New York Magazine approval matrices. So this goes from, you know, mid-brow to highbrow and from transparent to what the fuck, how does it work? So, you know, Mobius strips are forever going to be on that I don't understand it side just because they're super simple, but like the math is so complex. Some interesting things on here, like the Foldoscope is a project by Manu Prakash. He's at Stanford, and it's a paper microscope that costs like
5 cents to make. It has like a little plastic lens on it and works with like it has like a little LED light and this tiny battery. But you can get really, really good magnification with this. And so people are doing citizen science all around the world and bringing these like really cheap microscopes into environments where you can't bring like the expensive microscopes from the institutions. And so there's this whole theory that like, you can collect data you can collect more data using like less sophisticated tools and like perhaps get different kinds of ideas about science and notice different types of patterns. So he's investigating that. Mr. Wizard, always a source of inspiration. Completely obsessed with Fishley and Weiss. I watch The Way Things Go probably like once a month. So yeah, these are all my favorite things. So I have, I brought like some pop-up books if you all want to play with them and like check them out. Cause I know it's like super not fulfilling to like see a presentation about tangible tactile things and not be able to play with them. So I have someone to play with. I have some for sale if you want to buy one from me. But I also want your questions. Does anyone have any questions for me? Is that okay?
I think let's thank you and then people can talk to you. It's a little past the 7.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Thanks for sitting late. Thanks.